that.
Okay, I think we are live, so let's get started. Okay, so it's my
So
pleasure. Yeah, it's my pleasure to
just I will
introduce.
just
Oh,
I will just start the recording.
yeah, start the recording. Yes, good.
There you go.
Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Elena Ficara. She's a research fellow at the City University of New York, um, and she works at the intersection of philosophy of logic, paraconsistent logic, German idealism, especially Hegel, and other topics in theoretical philosophy as well. Um, Most recently, she published, I think her most recent book is The Form of Truth, Hegel's Philosophical Logic, and that was published end of 2020, 2021, beginning of 2021. She has a lot of articles, over 40, 45 articles in journals and edited volumes, published in a number of journals, History, Philosophy of Logic, History and Philosophy of Logic, Asian Journal of Philosophy, Fichte-Studien, Hegel-Studien. I could go on. Yeah, so it's always a pleasure to hear from Elena. And today we are going to hear a talk entitled On the Opposition Between Realism and Nominalism. No, Hegel on the Opposition Between Realism and Nominalism. So Elena, take it away. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Greg, for the very kind introduction. Thank you, Alessandro and Greg, for inviting me to participate in this very interesting seminar series. So what I'm presenting now is still a work in progress, and I think that you are, so there are the people who are here listening are actually experts on the topic I'm going to address, the topics of Hegel's, the relevance of Hegel's thoughts for contemporary logic, the topics of singularity. So I very much look forward to your questions and critique and comments. I am not an expert on the topic of singularity in Hegel, but I think that the topic is, in general, the question, what is singularity? What is the relevance of singularity in logic is a crucial question. And yes, I look forward to the discussion, probably more than to giving my presentation. So, Hegel devoted a long part of his lectures on the history of philosophy to medieval philosophy. Normally, these passages are not discussed in the context of an analysis of their meaning for Hegel's logic. Hegel's judgments about the medieval dialectic are indeed destructive. The works on logic by the ecclesiastic philosophers made, Hegel writes, of the spiritual something perfectly unspiritual. This formal dialectic was very ingenious in devising objects, problems, and questions, destitute of all philosophic interest. The scholastics discuss a host of oppositions, contrasts, contradictions, which have not the very slightest interest for us. For example, Julian, Archbishop of Toledo, sought with as great earnestness, as if the salvation of the human race depended on it, to answer questions such as, will those who rise again recover all that they lost here in the way of nails and hair? Additional examples of questions of this kind are given by those who ridicule the scholastic dialectic, for instance by Erasmus in his Encomium Moriae. Might God not have also taken the form of an ass or of a pumpkin? In what manner would the pumpkin have preached and wrought miracles? And how would it have been crucified? The main point is that the scholastics for Hegel were like barbarians in their way of handling divine things and bringing them into sensus, determinations, and relations. Thus, the medieval approach to logic for Hegel is hyper-intellectualistic. Scholastic dialectic is a Verstandeslogik that is even worse than Aristotle's syllogistics. It is a deterioration of Aristotle's Verstandeslogik, an application of the Aristotelian forms that has traits of madness, in that it turns what is spiritual, the divine content, into empirical and almost obscene determinations. On this basis, it may seem surprising that Hegel considered the controversy between realists and nominalists, which engage philosophers through very nearly the whole of the scholastic period, and which, as it emerges in Hegel's interpretation, is irretrievably related to logic, to be of great philosophical importance. So, my presentation has three parts. So the first is about Hegel's reading of the medieval controversy. The second is about the relevance of Hegel's reading of the medieval controversy for Hegel's idea of logic. And the third is about its relevance for logic in general. So the controversy between realists and nominalists occupied scholastic philosophy for many centuries and concerns a question that for Hegel is specifically philosophical. Hegel writes, was nun den Streit im Allgemeinen betrifft, so bezieht sich auf den Gegensatz des Allgemeinen und Individuellen. The controversy in general is related to the opposition between the universal and the individual. We could add that in this formulation, this is the philosophical question par excellence, the ancient question that goes hand in hand with the beginning of philosophy in Greece about the relationship between what is katolu, according to the whole, and what is katekaston, according to each individual. Hegel centers his reconstruction of the history of philosophy upon the universal. Philosophie als Wissen des Allgemeinen in Heraclitus. Philosophy is the science of the universal. In Anaxagoras, der Gedanke als das Un und für sich Seiende Allgemeine. Thought is the topic of Anaxagoras philosophy and is the universal in and for itself. Thought as philosophy's subject matter for Socrates, and what Hegel writes is, die Allgemeinheit dient den Stoffversenktis analysieren, so dass man das Allgemeine als allgemeines heraushebt, which means that analyzing the universality that is within experience, so that it is possible to extract universality from it, is the method of philosophy in Socrates, according to Hegel. The Megarians are in this respect paradigmatic. In this period Hegel wriits, I read it in German and then translated it into English. In dieser Periode ist also die Beziehung des Denkens auf das Sein gesetzt oder des Allgemeinen auf das Einzelne. Diese Beziehung ist widersprechend, Gegenstand der Philosophie, und das Allgemeine überhaupt das Wesen. So what Hegel writes is what I have marked in the quote, die Beziehung des Denkens auf das Sein oder des Allgemeinen auf das Einzelne, which means the relationship between thought and being, the relationship which is one and the same as the relationship between the universal and the individual. This is at the core of Megarian philosophy, the relationship between thought and being, which is one and the same as the relationship between the universal and the individual. And the second aspect, which I have underlined in the quote, diese Beziehung ist widersprechend, Gegenstand der Philosophie. This relationship between the universal and the individual as the topic of philosophy is contradictory. And so we see here already in Hegel's lectures on the history of philosophy in general, not yet in relation to the medieval controversy, that we have here already the articulation of the relationship between universal and individual as immanent negation and as the method of philosophy or the logic of philosophy. Now, on the dispute between realists and nominalists, Hegel says, es handelt sich das Universale, das heißt das Allgemeine oder die Gattung, das Wesen der Dinge, was bei Platon Idee genannt wurde. It is the question at stake is the question of the universal, which means the genus, the essence of things, what in Plato was called idea. So the question of at the center of the controversy is the universal in and for itself, independent of the thinking subject and independent of the particular existing thing, or is the universal only nominal, only in the subjective representation, something that is merely thought? For example, this is Hegel's example, the sentence, "It is blue." Does the universal being blue exist outside of the individual blue thing, which is observed in each case? Does it exist independently of the person who formulates the sentence, who observes the thing? For the realists, the universal exists outside of the thinking subject and is different from the individual thing. For the realists, the universal is the essence of things. The realism of the universal is thus different from the realism which was typical of Hegel's times, evidently. For nominalists, which Hegel also calls formalists, the universal is a mere representation, a subjective generalization. When generals are formed, Gattungen, they are mere names, they are formal, subjective. Only the individual is the real. And so we have the difference between the realism of the universals and the realism which was typical of Hegel's times. The realism Hegel is talking about is the realism of the friends of the ideas in Plato's Sophistes. For Hegel, the opposition between realists and nominalists is the highest opposition and something of the greatest interest. It is an opposition which we did not have in ancient philosophy. Ist von großem Interesse und ist ein viel höherer Gegensatz als die Alten gekannt haben. So, Hegel uses the expression viel höherer Gegensatz, which means here we have a much more radical opposition. It is a sharp incompatibility that takes the form of a contradiction. The realist position is seen as the negation of the nominalist one and vice versa. The relationship between universal and individual also takes the form of a contradiction. So one could express it so. The realists say the universal is real, they say P. The nominalists say the universal is not real, they say not P. The realists say the individual is not real, they say not Q. And the nominalists say the individual is real, they say Q. So the realist position is the negation of the nominalist one. Nominalism is the negation of realism. The universal is the negation of the individual, and the individual is the negation of the universal. The problem is for Hegel that the opponents in the controversy do not pass from the one to the other. Nicht von dem einen zum anderen kommen. The right way of treating the opposition, in contrast, implies passing from the one to the other, from P to not P and vice versa, from Q to not Q and vice versa, and from U and not U and vice versa. The truth does not lie in the realistic position, and it does not lie in the nominalistic position either. Rather, it consists in recognizing the interplay and reciprocal dependence of the two positions, and in acknowledging that it is not true that only the universal exists or is real, and the individual does not exist, is real, and that it is not true that only the individual exists, is real, and the universal does not exist, is not real. The real is expressed by the unity of the two positions, realism and nominalism, and of the two instances, universality and individuality. And so we have realism is not true, nominalism is not true. What is true is the unity of realism and nominalism. The universal is per se not real. The individual is disconnected from the universal, not real. What is real is the connection between the universal and the individual. If the truth is expressed by the unity of the two positions, realism and nominalism, and what is real is expressed by the unity of the two instances, universality and individuality, then the question emerges, what is the unity of the two positions and of the two instances? How does it work? On it, Hegel writes that Klassennominalism, Hegel sums up at the end of his reconstruction, he sums up and then explains what this unity consists in. He says, der Klassennominalismus erklärte also die allgemeinen Begriffe für bloße Namen und schrieb allein den Individuen Realität zu. Das Allgemeine, die Universalien, hat nur in der Sprache Realität, which means that nominalism says that universal concepts are mere names and that only the individual exists. Umgekehrt der Realismus, dass in dem individuellen Dinge keine Realität ist, sondern die Universalien allein Realität haben und dass sie unterscheidende nur ein Akzidenz oder eine reine Differenz ist. Sie kommen nicht recht von dem einen zum anderen. Realism, and here we have the important aspect, according to realism, only the universals exists. What distinguishes the universals from each other is, from the point of view of realism, a mere accident or a mere difference. And that's the problem for Hegel. And so the medievals do not pass from one position, from the nominalist approach to the realist approach. Es waren unter ihnen, welche den richtigen Gedanken fassten, dass die Einschränkung des Allgemeinen, und zwar des Allgemeinsten, des Seins, der Entität, die Individuation eine Negation ist. Some philosophers did have the right thought that the limitation of the universal, that individuation, is a negation. While the realists say the universals alone have reality and conceive what distinguishes them from each other as an accident or a mere difference, Hegel stresses that the distinction between the universals lies in their individuation, and their individuation is the negation, the critique of the abstract nature of the universals themselves. It is a sort of nominalistic instance within the realistic one. And we have here this immanent negation, the well-known dialectical device that turns the abstract, non-existing, non-real universal into a concrete, existing and real universal. That is a universal that is genuine expression of the individual. Hence, we have the defective position, typical of those who conceive the difference between universals as mere accidental difference between universals, and the right position, the difference is within the universal as individuation of the universal, Vereinzelung, which is singularization of the universal through self-critique, through immanent negation. Now, the first point that needs to be addressed now is the relevance of Hegel's reading of the controversy for Hegel's idea of logic. In his reconstruction of the medieval controversy between realists and nominalists, Hegel stresses the following points. The question about realism and nominalism is the question about the opposition between the universal and the individual. The important aspect is that in the medieval controversy, the opposition between the universal and the individual is developed in its highest form, which means that the universal is seen as the negation of the individual and vice versa. As Hegel puts it in the chapter of the lectures about the Megarians, the relationship between the universal and the individual is contradictory. The solution of the controversy is neither the realist nor the nominalist approach, but an approach that passes from the one to the other and mediates between the two. What is real is not the universal and not the individual, but their unity. The unification of realism and nominalism corresponds to the one of the universal and the individual. It consists in working at the level of the universal and in seeing that what distinguishes the universal determinations from each other is not an accident or a mere difference, but something that is immanent in the universal. In other words, the negation of the universal, the nominalistic attitude, has not the role of nullifying the universal, but of determining and individualizing it, distinguishing it from the other universals. In turn, the unity of universality and individuality, or the individuation or realization of the universal, its effective ability to be expression of reality, is reachable via negation, that is, the critique of the universal's abstract nature. Let us see what the Hegelian idea of a unity between the universal and the individual means in relation to logic, and especially I am focusing in here on Verstandeslogik. The universal is the very subject matter of Hegel's philosophical logic. In the preface to the Science of Logic's second edition, he calls it Das Logische. Das Logische refers to what for Plato was the net of the most general thought determinations that are expression of the essence of things. For Hegel, das Logische is the form of truth. It stands for the conceptual structures that tell us what there is and what its nature is. These structures are more specifically the forms of thought, Denkformen, the categories or pure concepts, Kategorien, what Hegel calls the concept, in singular, der Begriff. If we ask the medieval question, does das Logische exist? If so, how? Then the Hegelian perspective implies that it exists within each individual human thought, inference, conception, although not always explicitly. Das Logische is present, although implicitly and in hidden form, in each individual inference, even in each feeling and action which we perform daily. Hegel writes, das Logische is within all that which we make our own. And the expression Hegel uses is zu dem Seinigen machen, which means which each one of us makes her own. Das Logische, as the expression of the most general structures of our thought, is within the activity of each individual human being of making reality into an expression of their own peculiar and singular nature. For example, the several forms of syllogism makes themselves constantly felt in our cognition. If anyone, when awaking on a winter morning, hears the creaking of the carriages on the street, and is thus led to conclude that it has frozen hard in the night, he has gone through a syllogistic operation, an operation which is every day repeated under the greatest variety of conditions. The specific inference in the morning of a specific day in a specific year, when one heard the creaking of the carriages on the street and concluded that it had frozen hard in the night, is an example of the way in which the universal, the syllogistic form, and the individual inference deployed in a specific context by a specific individual, are joined together in an irretrievable connection. Yet, as Hegel stresses in relation to the treatment of the syllogistic forms in Verstandeslogik, in der Verstandeslogik werden die Formen nicht der Kritik, ob sie an und für sich ein wahres seien, unterworfen, ob diese Formen Formen der Wahrheit seien, an diese Untersuchung wird nicht gedacht. In intellectual logic, the forms are not subject to critique. And the question is not asked whether they are something true, whether they are forms of truth, this question is not asked. This problem is not thought about. The universal form, which is found and fixed through abstraction and reflection in the logical and metaphysical theories, raises the claim to be form of truth, but this claim can be unjustified. In order to be a genuine form of truth, the form, the universal, must negate itself, its own abstract character. In other words, in working as metaphysicians and logicians, we work with universal forms, categories, forms of thought, concepts, but our research is able to become truly scientific for Hegel only insofar as it encompasses the critique of the abstractness of the universals and the consideration of their instantiation. In so doing, the universal individualizes itself. It manages to become expression of reality. So, for example, in the example, if anyone, when awaking on a winter morning, hears the creaking of the carriages on the street, and is thus led to conclude that it has frozen hard in the night, he has gone through a syllogistic operation, an operation which is every day repeated under the greatest variety of conditions. So if we extract from our everyday operation through reflection and abstraction the form P, if P then Q, therefore Q. The question that the logic of Hegel's times does not ask, but that needs to be asked, is this form a form of truth? For Hegel, the forms fixed in syllogistic logic are not forms of truth. For example, the form P, if P then Q, therefore Q, is in this case not a form of truth. In the case of if someone is human, then they are not divine. Jesus is human, therefore Jesus is not divine. Hence, the form that negates itself is the proper theme of Hegel's science of logic. Die logische Form, die sich als diese bestimmte aufhebt, gibt eben darin ihren Anspruch, dass sie an und für sich gelte auf, dann ist die Logik Wissenschaft der Vernunft. Which means that logic becomes a science in the moment in which the logical form abandons its claim to be a universal form of truth. In sum, in Verstandeslogik and Verstandesmetaphysik, the specific form in the example modus ponens claims to be a universal form of truth, but clashes as such with individual examples of inferences. So in the human divine example, that do not conform to modus ponens, but are nevertheless bad. In Hegel's conception of logic, the specific form encompasses its own negation, that is, the consideration of its own limitation insofar as it abstracts from the individual cases, and via self-negation does manage to open itself up, to overcome its abstract nature, and to become form of truth in each individual case. This is, in other words, what Hegel stresses in his discussion of the medieval controversy. The universal, if it is disconnected from the individual, is limited, that is abstract and not able to grasp reality. The right thought is that the individuation of the universal is a negation. And this is the quote in Hegel's reading of the medieval controversy, which we have already discussed. Es waren unter ihnen welche den richtigen Gedanken fassten, dass die Einschränkung des Allgemeinen die Individuation eine Negation ist. So some among the medieval philosophers grasped the right thought that the limitation of the universal, the individuation, is a negation. This introduces the idea of the dialectic between the universal and the individual. And so the point is, what is the relevance of the Hegelian reading of the medieval controversy, so reconstructed for logic in general? That the question about the universal is the core logical question and goes hand in hand with the question concerning the relationship between logic and reality is an insight that is central in traditional, especially Hegelian logic. In the so-called modern classical or non-classical logic, there is a certain ambivalence in this respect. Klima observes it might seem that the problem of universals should have little to do with the issue of the subject matter of logic. After all, in formal logic, we deal with the deductive validity of arguments based on their formal structure, whereas the problem of universals at least in one of its possible formulations, is the question of what corresponds to the universal terms of our language. Historical, the two aspects, logic understood as a theory of valid reasoning, and the controversy about the universals, are strongly connected with each other. Yet, their somewhat natural connection seems to be seen as a disturbance, as the historical development of logic testifies. Porphyry raised the fundamental questions concerning universals just in order to set them aside as pertaining to deeper inquiries, but not to logic. It is one of the ironies of the history of ideas that it was precisely on account of these questions that medieval logicians got so much involved in these deeper inquiries that John of Salisbury, in his Metalogicon, had to complain about how his contemporaries' endless debates over the issue of universals confuse rather than instruct their students of introductory logic. It is possible to admit that the semantic conception of validity in predicate logic does correspond to the way in which, in logic and theory of valid inference, the question of the universals is present. The semantic notion of truth and logical validity in predicate logic, being dependent on what the correlates of our universal terms are, demand at least a certain semantic clarification of the issue of universals. The usual set theoretic way to deal with the question of the universals as predicates means that we conceive them as sets. And the idea goes back to Frege's Grundgesetze der Arithmetik. For each predicate P, if P equals run, then we read the formula as run. There is a set such that for each object y is an element of X, if and only if P of y. For example, we take the predicate being a human. For this predicate, there is a set such that someone, for example, Elena, is an element of this set, if and only if she is a human. The predicate or the universal is being a human, and the object, the individual, Elena. It is assumed that the universal, being a human, is the set or class of the individuals who have the property of being a human. The unity of universality and individuality is presupposed. One could assume that that this is a Hegelian trait, but we do not have a solution of the ontological and metaphysical questions. Do sets, classes exist? If so, how? Do only objects, individuals exist? If sets, classes stand for something that there is, what is the ontological counterpart of a set? Armstrong writes, classes have turned out to be rather mysterious entities in modern metaphysics. Nobody seems to have a firm grip on their nature. It is possible to point out that in the ideas of logical validity and truth, certain presuppositions about the universals, their nature and their relation to the individuals are at work. David Armstrong, the contemporary philosopher who has devoted a decisive part of his work to this issue, suggests, not differently from the ancient philosophers, he especially recognizes Aristotle as his main predecessor, and the founders of classical logic, he especially refers to Wittgenstein and Russell, the idea that reality is sentence-like, which means that there is a reciprocal foundation between the logical structure of our language and reasoning and the structure of reality. The relationship between reality and logic passes via the account of the universals. The universals are rooted in the way we speak and reason. Predicates stand for properties of or relations between objects and are universal in that they can be said of many things. Properties and relations exist on this picture only insofar as they are instantiated in individuals. It is possible to appreciate that logic's natural inclination is Aristotelian, realistic and alethic. Every logic, more specifically, is methodologically realist. One can thus argue that this word of reality, we postulate in doing logic, is a word of individuals that instantiate universals. In sum, in my paper, I have presented Hegel's reading of the medieval controversy between realism and nominalism as very important, not only for addressing in a very simple way some questions at the basis of Hegel's idea of logic, but also for making a new way to think about the metaphysical and philosophical presuppositions of logic possible. The problem of the connection between the universal and the individual is the one that is opened up as a metaphysical assumption or a postulate when we do logic. Importantly, such an account is precisely the focus of Hegel's philosophical logic. Hegel's idea of logic is rooted in an articulated vision of the universal. In this reading of the medieval controversy between realists and nominalists, this complex account is presented in extremely simple and clear terms. Hegel hints here at his own solution of the controversy. Neither the realist nor the nominalist position is true, but only they're passing from the one to the other. Neither the universal nor the individual are real on their own, but only their unity is what is real. Universals exist only so far as they are united with individuals, and individuals are never alone without universals. More specifically, we can read Hegel's idea about the unity of the universal and the individual in his discussion of the medieval controversy as meaning that universals exist only instantiated in individuals, and individuals always instantiate universals. This insight conforms to the broadly Aristotelian account of the metaphysical positions of logic I have sketched above. The new aspect in Hegel's account, which stands out if seen from a normal logical point of view, is the idea of the individuation of the universal as negation, and of the dialectic between the universal and the individual. What does it mean that the universal and the individual are contradictorily opposed to each other, and that their unity is to be seen as the solution of the opposition? Does the Hegelian conception of a dialectic between the universal and the individual have any upshots for the question about the metaphysical basis of logic? This question, the question of the specific way in which the universal and the individual are united in Hegel's notion of the concrete universal, is at the basis of some groundbreaking classical and contemporary works. Among them, Vera, Dusing, Nuzzo, Schäfer, Stern, De Cesaris, Giladi, and Moss. In my interpretation, from the Hegelian treatment of the medieval controversy, we can clearly derive the insight that the dialectic between the universal and the individual does not change the Aristotelian picture about the metaphysical basis of logic, about the reality that is presupposed when we do logic and philosophy. Rather, the Hegelian theory of the opposition between the universal and the individual has a methodological and metaphilosophical relevance. It is more than an explication of the metaphysical basis of logic. It is a philosophical foundation of logic, in the complete meaning of philosophy that does not only comprehend metaphysics, but also epistemology and metaphilosophy, among others. The dialectic between the universal and the individual, which is one and the same as Hegel's theory about the universal's immanent negation, rather concerns the methodological path we have to follow if we want the universal to be genuine expression of reality, and so a form of the truth of each one of our inferences. By way of a conclusion, it is possible to stress three basic insights that can be drawn from Hegel's reading of the medieval controversy and that are useful for locating at a preliminary level Hegel's perspective on realism and nominalism within current conceptions of logic and philosophy. The first, the metaphilosophical primacy of the universal. Philosophy's subject matter, starting from its beginning in ancient Greece, is for Hegel the universal. Accordingly, as I have shown, the universal, which Hegel calls das Logische, the categories, the forms of thought, the concept, is the subject matter of Hegel's philosophical logic. So stated from Hegel's account, we can derive the clarification that the universal is what we deal with when we do philosophy and logic. Secondly, the ontological primacy of the individual. Das Einzelne ist dasselbe, was das Wirkliche ist, which means that the individual is what is real. Hence, in order for the universal to become expression of reality, to become a form of truth, and to be real, it needs to become an individualized universal. In Hegel's account, we can thus appreciate the view that the world or reality we are dealing with when we do philosophy and logic is a world or reality of individuals that instantiate universals. Finally, the methodological meaning of the dialectic of the universal. This dialectic is what allows to pass from the abstract, non-real universal to the concrete, real universal. the individualized or singularized universal, and to make logic and philosophy apt to grasp reality and be form of truth, be expression of what is. In Hegel's account, we can thus recognize a new approach to logic, which not only involves the fixation of forms of valid reasoning, but also its correction in light of the effective truth of our inferences in natural and philosophical language. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Elena, for the very, very wonderful talk and very kept time well. So thanks so much. Yeah, so very, very stimulating talk on singularity, realism, nominalism. So we have a good hour or a good 40 minutes or so for questions. So you can either raise your hand so I can actually see you in the Zoom call. You can also react using the react button. And if you're on YouTube, you can just put your question in the chat and I will read it here. So it looks like Alex, your hand is up, so you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And thank you, Elena. This was really inspiring. And also, I mean, this is it, basically. Namely, you really touched all the issues that were really at the core of the reason why I and Greg started discussing on this topic and decided to propose to organize this seminar. So it was really, really great. And I also believe there are some elements that really that we all share. Namely, for instance, the idea that maybe the best way to read Hegel's understanding of singularity is also with connection to the history of philosophy, which is something you do very much in your work, and I really appreciate. So the idea that, I mean, this is not a new problem. This is the problem of philosophy, and Hegel not only does provide a new answer to it, but also tries to enlighten how this was a huge problem and how it was dealt with throughout the tradition. I have many questions, but I will start with one, so that maybe, I mean, we can all discuss together. The first of all, maybe there are a few questions that has to do with the tradition, and so maybe with the historical reading of Hegel. Maybe there is a very simple one that I'd like to get out of the way. So you said the novelty of Hegel's understanding of the relationship between the universal and the individual is negation. So this idea that the universal individuates itself through negation. And I wanted to ask you whether, I mean, in a way, this idea isn't already included in Plato's and Aristotle's metaphysics when they speak about the ideas in Plato and specific difference in Aristotle. Because in a way, I mean, a very simple way to understand the role of negation in the individuation of universals is specific difference. So that's that very specific kind of negation that is, so to say, the difference that makes out the species and differentiates the genus. But if that's the case, maybe there is one issue that is very, very important. Namely, the Aristotelian tradition tells us something that is maybe one of the big problems when it comes to singularity. Namely, there is no passage, there is no Übergang from the universal to the singular. So you cannot, so to say, add differences so much that at a certain point you end up with an individual. There is, so to say, a jump that you cannot logically make from the universal to the singular. Whereas there are other traditions, I'm thinking about Leibniz, for instance, that say, no, really, it's just, an individual is just a fully determined concept, so to say. So it's just, there is this notion of complete concept in a way. So the basic question was, what do you think of this idea of negation as specific difference? And the second one is, do you think that according to Hegel, then it is possible to have this sort of passage, so this sort of development from the universal to the individual via negation, which is something that in the tradition is contemplated, but sometimes explicitly excluded, so to say. And again, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Alessandro, for these questions that are also, I must admit, they are the question that I asked myself while thinking about this problem, about the problem of the connection between individuality and universality in Hegel, about what this means from a normal from a normal logical point of view, or from the point of view of the tradition of logic, from the point of view of the history of logic. What is it? And the question that you asked are also the questions that I would ask, which are what is the connection between diathesis and Hegel's idea of the concretization of the universal? Is it the same thing? Well, in some sense, evidently, Hegel sees his idea of the concrete universal already prefigured in Plato's idea of idea, and in Aristotle's idea of noesis noeseos, or in Aristotle's idea of the substance. Yet Hegel also distinguishes his view of the concrete universal, or of the dialectics between the universal and the individual, from the logical tradition. Evidently, we could say the negation, or this universal that is negation, is the process through which one determines the content of a concept, the diathesis, the form of classification used in ancient logic, in which one starts with a general concept, then divides it into two or more specific subconcepts, and this procedure is repeated until the concept is finally determined. But the position that for Hegel is the right one implies something more than that. Implies really this idea of negation, and negation intended as contradictory forming operator. And Hegel distinguishes evidently his own dialectical method from the method of diathesis and from the method of definition. And he does that in the various versions of his logic in the Jena period. There are many chapters about the difference between the procedure of Einteilung, which would be diathesis, and the dialectics, and the differences between the procedure of definition and dialectics. What exactly the difference is, I don't know. I hope, I think this is a work in progress. We are all engaged. So this, or I think there are evidently already many works, Verra and Güsing and Schäfer. So these are all historical works about these specific differences between diathesis, the method of diathesis, the method of definition, the method of dialectics. But the point would be to understand what this is in contemporary terms, from the point of view, or from the point of view of logic, from the point of view of the history of logic and also of the history of contemporary logic. And then yes, so the point is, do we reach the end point of the diathesis, or is there a jump between the procedure of Einteilung, of distinction, and the full characterization and the full grasp of the individual? And then you say that an alternative approach would be Leibniz approach. And the individual is the fully determined concept. I think that in Hegel, if we say that there is a difference between the Aristotelian approach and the Leibnizian approach on this subject, probably the Hegelian one is closer to Leibniz one, but I'm not sure about it. So I have still to think about it. Sorry.
If I may, Greg, if I may say just one other thing, just to develop this. This was the starting point of my Hegel book, because there is this nice, interesting quote in the first writing by Leibniz, which is the dissertation on the principle of the individual. And there is a sentence that I used then as an epigraph in a way, which is it was fun, in my opinion, where Hegel says, when Leibniz says, what does it mean? How is it possible? It's impossible to determine the individual by negation and not by affirmation. So it is explicitly, so in a way, it is very anti-Leibnizian, so to say, Hegel's stance. And I believe Franca maybe wants to add something on this, but just to close, the idea is really, it will be interesting, and that was at least my choice to choose this comparison with Leibniz, because apparently, so to say, Leibniz is closer to Hegel in a way that there isn't this, so to say, jump between just logic and physical dimension, or universal and singular, etc., etc. But then really what happens is that you have a notion of negation that maybe is not as strong as Hegel meant it, because I mean, the answer I will give to my own question is, it is not about difference, it's about negation. So it's not about difference, it's about, so to say, self-negation. And I think Greg also agrees, but I mean, we are all looking for an answer. And maybe, I don't know, Franca, Greg, I'll let you administrate everything, but I believe Franca wanted to add something.
Thanks. Yeah, Franca, please. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you, Elena, and thank you, Alessandro, and thank you all for this interesting seminar. Basically, I think, well, about individuation and the difference between individual and individuation. Okay. And this is my concern, I would say, about Hegel's positions as to as to Elena has reconstructed it. Well, but basically I have first one very stupid question, and then I think a very intelligent question. But the first one, I begin by the very stupid one. The very stupid is, what's the exact difference, according to you, Elena, and to Alessandro, not strictly connected to Hegel, but in general also to Leibniz, to Aristotle, and so on, between singularity and individuality? And this is a stupid question, because I think that you have a question, a very informed question, And it is stupid because I don't know anything about singularity. In fact, I tended to underrate singularity. Singularity is not important for me. This is my attitude, wrong attitude, but because well, it is typical of person who doesn't know, doesn't know well about something about, well, doesn't capture the nature of a certain concept, and so they tend to reject it. Well, this is my question, which is on one side connected to what Alessandro said about the eceitas of singularity, and about il principium individuationis, Leibniz principium individuationis, which is different from the fact that we acknowledge the existence of singularities as individual fact. So you mentioned something about this when you spoke about specific inference, specific noise in the inference about the morning with the frozen egg. And the other question was about, not so intelligent anyway, it was about immanent negation. Is there a difference between immanent negation and negation as a contradictory operator? Because you said that for Hegel, negation is always contradiction operator. Okay. In case of immanent negation, what should we say about it? Is still something to be connected to contradiction, or is something of another level of analysis, so to say? Okay, that's all.
Okay, on the second question, I think that in the context of Hegel's analysis of the medieval controversy, one could say that the difference between the immanent negation or negate of, so he writes about the limitation of the universal as negation, and this is just so this is a negation as I would say immanent negation and as contradictory forming operator and as the critique of the universal. It's just so what Hegel says is there is a difference between the differences between universals and the negation of the universal. The negation of the universal is the critique of the universal's claim to be universal. But I don't know if this is an answer, or if I don't know if
I think that it is enough.
This is an answer.
I wanted to know something more about the notion.
Yeah, the immanent negation, because then evidently the whole dialectics of between universals and individuals, or the concrete universal, which is one and the same as the dialectical method. So one could say the dialectics stands and falls with the concrete universal. So this is the same thing. Implies a double use of negation. So I repeat, so the negation and then the negation of the negation. And then the question would be, is then the yeah is then the negation that is maintained within the fully developed universal still a contradictory forming operator, yes or no? I don't know. But and on the first question, I know what I know is so I simply assumed in my talk that individuality and singularity can be used as synonyms. But I know that Alessandro has worked on the difference between universality and individuality. So Alessandro can answer your question.
Thank you, Elena. Well, actually, Franca, this is, I mean, it's not a stupid question at all. It is basically the question of this seminar, because it's the reason why me and Greg, correct me if I'm wrong, started working on this notion, because in a way, so Elena is right. I mean, it's for in many aspects, it is safe to use singular and individual as synonyms, and it happens that Hegel does it sometimes, but a big problem in the translations of Hegel's, for instance, is that in the Italian translations by Croce, for instance, das Einzelne was always translated as the individual, so there was no difference whatsoever in the.
Sorry, and for Croce, the difference was underlined or not?
No.
No, for Croce there was no difference. So
Okay.
so for Croce there was no difference. For also for Moni, for the translator of the Science of Logic, there was no difference. So for instance, in the La Terza translation of the Science of Logic, you will find das Einzelne as the individual.
Okay.
Yeah, precisely. And also in the first English translations, is that right, Greg? I believe the first translations of the Science of Logic, of the Encyclopedia, and of Phenomenology do not differentiate. And then Giorgio Di Giovanni, for instance, in this new translation of the Science of Logic, started making the difference, and also Terry Pinkard in his translation of the Phenomenology. So
Yeah.
my view, so I can tell you how I see it. I believe that in Hegel, in the path of Hegel's philosophy, it is possible to trace the development of a technical meaning of singularity, so to say. And so the whole point, and I believe me and Greg shared this idea, is that it is possible to make the case that the true technical term in Hegel's philosophy, and the real, pivotal element in Hegel's philosophy, is not universality but singularity. So that in a way, Hegel understands his philosophy as a philosophy of singularity rather than a philosophy of universality. So in the context of logic, this is very clear, because, for instance, you have a section on singularity, and then you have individuality as a new category. So you have a way of determining why not all singular, not everything that is singular is also individuated, as you rightly pointed out. And this is also a very important problem with respect to contemporary thought, because I believe that singularity has become, so to say, also a very strongly, has become a term that has been very strongly charged with political elements. So when you listen to, I don't know, if you read French contemporary philosophers, they have this idea of the singular against the individual, the singular rather than the individual.
For instance, Gilles Deleuze.
For instance, Deleuze, yeah, precisely. For instance, Deleuze, or also in Simondon's philosophy, in Nancy, etc., etc. So the idea is that, I mean, when you speak about singularity in the contemporary debate, you usually are implicitly referencing French contemporary thought. And I believe one of the starting points of this seminar was for me and Greg to say, hey, there was a guy who, I mean, there is a tradition, so to say, there is a tradition in the history of philosophy that points out the philosophical relevance of singularity as a specific category. Of course, what is really interesting and what is necessary to point out is precisely whether there is a difference between individuality and singularity. For instance, last week there was actually a Deleuze scholar who wrote a beautiful book on Duns Scotus. And for instance, he tries to show how the whole debate on individuality and singularity in contemporary French philosophy already takes place in the 13th century. So there is a
you mentioned something like eccetas.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah. So the problem is, I think you very rightly pointed out something which is important for us in this seminar, namely, so what makes something singular is not the same question as what makes something this individual and not that individual. So the problem of singularity and the problem of individuation are, of course, very closely connected, but are not the same question. So, in this discussion, for instance, a very interesting notion is why is something universal and not singular, or why it's something singular and not universal? And I guess
just, it is a very small question. No, and maybe I already have the answer in a sense. Yeah, you already gave me the answer. So I'll go on, and if there's there's an occasion we will discuss about it. Thank you.
Perfect. No, just I think the debate on realism and nominalism is a very good way of addressing the issue. So thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll take the opportunity to chime in. Yeah, so thanks so much, Elena, for the talk. And maybe I just add to the conversation about what I think singularity, Einzelheit, is in Hegel, and maybe also ask you a question, Elena. Yeah, I think it's an advance in the Übersetzungen that Einzelheit is taken as singularity and not as individuality, because also it just tracks a different term, Individualität, so you have these different terms are tracked here. And singularity, like Alessandro was saying, it's shows up there as really what the universal determines itself to be. So it's Allgemeinheit, Besonderheit, Einzelheit. So the Allgemeinheit makes itself a Besonderheit, and then out of Besonderheit you get the Einzelheit, which is the return to Allgemeinheit, right? So singularity is the return to universality out of particularity, or you could say the unity of universality and particularity, right? So I think singularity is really the concrete universal that Elena was talking about. It's the universal is universal in particular, the particular is universal in particular. As Hegel says, universal, particular, and singular are all singulars. They're all singularity. Universal, particular, singular are all universals. Universal, particular, singular are all particulars. And this works for us dialethists just fine. Not so well for other people, but for us, it's just fine. Now, I just noting there about singularity specifically, what I think its technical sense is, and I think this is an important thing to emphasize. And Alessandro and I have done this in English and in Italian, so now we need to do it in all the other languages. Elena, I want to ask you a question. I like to think of the universal as self-singularizing, that Hegel's universal singularizes itself, makes itself singular through something like immanent negation, as you referred to, this contradictory operator. I prefer talking about self-particularization or self-negation, but all of this, I think, is seems just right to me. And this self-singularizing, I think, really seems quite unique, the way Hegel conceives of self-singularization. So in the history, usually you have more than one principle, right, for singularizing. You don't singularize by the universal itself. Abstract universals don't self-singularize, right? So one of the interesting questions is how in Hegel's rethinking of the universal, that you have a universal that's somehow singularizing itself, that you don't need multiple principles to go from universal to singular. But there's also maybe connection to the tradition we haven't spoken of, which is the ontological argument. He says that the concept is basically God, or the concept of God. Sometimes he uses these interchangeably. And you have a concept that's making itself singular on its own, right? It's a possibility that makes itself actual all by itself. Doesn't need help from the outside to make itself into this such and such. So I'm also curious about this connection to the ontological argument, because that also is a different historical set of references. And it's an argument that I recently decided I really like. And maybe not every version of it, but Hegel's, one could say, dialectical rendering of it, I find highly plausible. So I guess that's a connection to the metaphysics, right? Where of course Aristotle didn't have this kind of argument. So I wonder, and of course, the idea of self-singularizing universal is also a transformation of method, as you pointed out, right? It's a rethinking of method. Let me ask you a question. I've just been talking. It's kind of late here, and I've been thinking too long today. Let me ask you a question about, this word Einzelheit comes up in the Phenomenology of Spirit, the very beginning of the book. The this, right, is an Einzelheit, and the Spirit says, or consciousness says, this is the absolute, right? And this Einzelheit, the Ich is an Einzelheit, and the object is an Einzelheit, and all there is the Einzelheit, and there's no universal, right? So actually, very interesting. Consciousness says this is the truth, and then we discover, of course, that the Einzelheit really is universal, not just singular. Okay, which is interesting. But then singularity also shows up in the logic, completely divorced from those questions, and the universal is somehow singularizing itself. Interesting. So there's just these two places, which is also very different. Where in the one case, Einzelheit is devoid of universality. This is the absolute, and it's not universal. And then there's Einzelheit showing up in the logic, which is universal and particular. It's both of them, kind of this unity that you're talking about of realism and nominalism or something. Like there's some kind of. So I don't know what you make of this, but it raises a question for me about how is the universal self-singularizing? To what extent can it really self-singularize? It seems that it singularizes itself in logic, right? So the concept determines itself to be being, nothing, determinate being. And every category is universal, right? It's a concept of the absolute. It's a particular concept in the logic. So it's universal. Every category is universal and particular. Every category is singular from beginning to end. So the universal seems to self-singularize in logic. That's what it does. That's the dialectic. That's what you're talking about. But does it self-singularize, like, it doesn't seem to self-singularize and produce like Krug's pen, right? So Krug says, deduce this pen, Hegel. It's almost like Krug saying, oh, we say, this in the phenomenology sense of the singular. And the universal doesn't, of course, and can't produce this. And Hegel says, it's not my job. So what's very interesting to me is to see how the universal self-singularizes in one sense, kind of fully, developing a complete concept back to the Leibniz idea. But on the other hand, the universal doesn't seem able to, and nor should we expect it to, singularize itself as Krug's pen. So I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about two different ways of self-singularizing. One which is kind of wholly within logic itself, and the other which somehow would involve a more obscene, one could say, development of the pure concept out of itself into a sensuous singularity that no philosopher in the history of thought has ever been able to produce Krug's pen, and nor would anybody be advised to try to. I don't know if that question made sense, and it took me like 10 minutes to make it, but I did. So.
No, thank you, Greg. No, it's super interesting to listen to you, to listen also to Alessandro, because I think you are you're much more within this problem than I am. So I am actually learning a lot from you both. Yes, I agree. I think this expression is very nice. The expression of this singularization of the universal or the self-singularizing universal is very nice. And it is also, so we have it in Hegel's text. Hegel writes Vereinzelnes, Allgemeines, Sie Vereinzelnes. So there is, so it is textually, philologically very correct. So what? So what you say is also absolutely. I think that the question of the ontological argument is exactly the question of the demonstration of the existence of God as the process of the concretization of the universal or of the singularization of the universal. So this is a good way to approach this problem. I agree with you. I think it is heuristically good to do it in this way, to interpret the ontological argument in this way. And then the problem of singularity in the phenomenology of spirit vis-a-vis the science of logic, also super interesting. In the discussion of sense certainty, the historical reference point is Megarian philosophy. And in the lectures on the history of philosophy, in the chapter on Megarian philosophy, Hegel shows that the universal actually is the very topic of Megarian philosophy, and that the idea is to show that if one assumes the existence of the individual, then this produces contradictions which show that only the universal exists. And in the chapter on sense certainty, it seems to me that the main problem is to show that if we state that what is the here and what is the now, then the here and the now are universals. So what we are saying is not what we want to say. We want to state singularity or individuality, and what we state is actually universality.
Yes.
And in the phenomenology of spirit is also super interesting, the question of the unhappy consciousness, right? Because so there is a very good article by Christian Spahn on the fact that the chapter on unhappy consciousness has been usually interpreted as Hegel's critique of, or Hegel's abandonment of the idea of singularity, but in fact what Hegel is doing in the chapter on the unhappy consciousness is to criticize the de-evaluation of singularity.
Yeah.
Not to de-evaluate singularity, but to criticize the evaluation of singularity by the phenomenological figure of the unhappy consciousness. Yes. Okay, but did I answer your question?
Yeah, so halfway, and I think as much as one can. So it was very helpful that, also interesting that as you rehearse the phenomenology part, the dialectic, that when you say the singular is the absolute, this is the truth, and you mean something that is not universal, you end up, in fact, because again, what we know of the singular already from logic is that the universal is essential to it. Of course, it will. The truth of the singular is the universal. This makes good sense with it. But then there's also the other way around. If you begin with their singular, you'll get to the universal. But if you begin with the universal, you should be able to get to the singular. What kind of singular? And generally, like, these are the classical, I guess I keep bringing this up because I'm writing a book about this question. I guess somehow, I don't know if it's a problem for anyone but me, but that the universal can make itself singular, can make itself into a singular universal. But it seems that it cannot make itself into a sensuous singularity. That sensuous singularity is just, there's a kind of brute otherness that a pure concept of logic can't generate. Of course, it doesn't mean that this sensuous singularity is conceptually determined. Of course it is. But how does one, is there a limit to self-singularization? I guess, just in general, I don't expect you to answer that now, but it's an open question that I'm thinking about is, and logically speaking, like, how much can one in fact demonstrate, beginning from the universal, right?
But I would discuss the idea that the individualization of the universal implies becoming sensus sensus of the universal. I would say that the dialectics of the universal and the individual has a specifically metaphilosophical relevance, which implies that what is individualized, so that what is in the end is not something that exists in external reality.
Yes, of course. Yes.
But exists in thought.
Yes. So it exists in thought, but the singularity of this, one can't read this out of any universal, I don't think, concrete or otherwise. And I guess I don't think Hegel tries to.
No.
Even though this doesn't exist independently, as you say, of the conversal, for certainly it doesn't and can't.
Okay.
But I don't know. So I won't repeat myself over and over again.
But what you want to do in the book is not what Krug wanted to do, right?
Yes. So I'm not trying to do that.
Deduce the pen.
Yeah, I don't think it's possible. But I think what's interesting is to consider, maybe this is Schelling comes in, as I've been reading too much of him, I guess, and he comes into the conversation. So I'm the ventriloquist with Schelling. Is that
stop reading Schelling?
Reading too many philosophers. I was reading Merleau-Ponty the other day, and now he's confusing me as well. I went, oh, Alex is shaking his head. Okay, so don't worry.
Merleau-Ponty, then problems come.
Okay. No, but yeah, so the question is whether, in fact, the impotence of the concept the concept is in fact impotent to generate singulars like Krug's pen. So the concept is not impotent to generate its own content, its own, say, logical content. Being generate, the logic is a self-generating, generates its own content. Even philosophy of nature generates its own content. But there's another way in which the concept is impotent to, it seems, generate those singularities, if we want to call them singularities. Maybe they're individualities, not singularities, I don't know. But then there's a kind of, there's a question, is there a dualism then? Is there a limit to the power of the concept, which, again, Hegel usually doesn't describe the concept in those terms, like it's God, it's self-realizing, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So just an open question to everybody, not just you, Elena. Thank you so much. Okay, Alex, you have the last question, because I think I took too much time. So
no, you didn't. I actually wanted to weigh in on this issue. First of all, I was wondering whether a very good way of answering to Kruger is to highlight the difference between singularity and individuality.
Yes.
So that was really, just a random thought I had. So the fact that the concept singularizes itself, it does not mean that you have to be able to, so to say, individuate anything that comes out of the concept, so to say, and deduce it as Kruger wants you to do. But if I get your question correctly, your question is whether the singular at the beginning of the phenomenology is the same singular than you find at the end of the logic. So maybe there is one way of asking your question, and I'd say I'd answer yes and no. So I believe Hegel, both on the historical then on the systematic level, I believe Hegel is very ambivalent on this. I think it's a very good starting point to see how Hegel uses singularity both as a, so to say, as a problem, as an anti-philosophical word, and as a technical term in his own philosophy. And I believe what is very interesting about singularity is this liminal element to it. So I think that's a very good question. So to ask, so to say, if these two paths meet somewhere. So if you're always talking about the same kind of singularity, I believe that's a very good question. Maybe I had a last question for Elena. Just it's not a critical question, but maybe it's a way of highlighting where maybe our paths do not cross as much. And I wanted to ask you what you think about this, because if I understand your work, you do something very beautiful. So you try and use Hegel as a way of as a critical element in the tradition of the history of logic. But in a way, you see Hegel's philosophy as a very good contribution to contemporary logic as well. I mean, you think that Hegel's own logic can be used as a way to criticize, but also to improve and maybe to solve some issues that are present in contemporary philosophical logic. But maybe, I mean, there is something that is inherently problematic about how logic thinks problems sometimes. So for instance, I was thinking about what you said at the end of your paper when you said something about instantiation. So the idea about Klima, I believe it was, the problem of semantic validity. So if we understand the problem of the relationship between universality and individuality as the problem of semantic validity, namely, so in simple terms, whether there is a referent to a logical term, so to say. So whether, for instance, a universal is instantiated, or whether there is something that corresponds to what is stated in a sentence, isn't that, I mean, an inherently problematic issue? That is, that we keep doing what maybe Hegel is telling us we cannot do, namely treat universals and individuals as two kinds of things as two kinds of beings, so to say. So if we keep understanding universality as a possible referent, as a possible, so to say, semantic correlate of a proposition, in the end, aren't we, so to say, singularizing it in a bad way? That's what I'd say. So making it into some sort of thing, and so the question is, maybe there are two ways of understanding Hegel's logic as a contribution to contemporary logic. One is, of course, to see the inherent mechanism of how the relationship between universal and singular work, etc., etc. One other maybe is precisely this one. So to say, listen, this opposition between realism and nominalism is interesting because the opposition in itself is pointless. And it is pointless because you keep at the very core of the way you're investigating the matter, you keep treating, so to say, universals and singulars as things. So you keep treating them as individuated elements that you can use like bricks in a Lego construction in a way. So I wanted to know what you think about this possible criticism and whether it is still compatible with some sort of use of Hegel in the context of contemporary philosophical logic. I don't know whether my question was clear, so to say.
No, I see the motivation of your question is very clear, I think. So the point is, is it a reasonable enterprise to try to establish a dialogue between Hegel's logic and metaphysics and the way in which and contemporary logic and metaphysics? Is it reasonable?
I think it's very reasonable. I think it's great what you.
I don't know.
No.
So sometimes I think no, it isn't. But and the problem is how logic thinks. So what are the metaphysical presuppositions of logic? So the way in which logic thinks seems to be radically different from the Hegelian approach to logic and metaphysics. What I tried to say in my presentation is that there is a basic Aristotelian realistic assumption of which is active in logic, also in logic today, both classical and non-classical, and that this basically Aristotelian assumption is the basic correspondentistic assumption that we also have in Hegel. So in Hegel, it is the case that truth is adequatio. So it is the case that truth is correspondence. But what Hegel wants to do is much more than that. So what Hegel wants to do is also to conceive truth as encompassing the analysis of the possibility conditions of truth as adequatio. So in Hegel, we have a notion of truth which encompasses both adequatio and the possibility conditions of adequatio. And this is also something that could be found in logic. So logic is the attempt to work on the possibility conditions of truth as adequatio. Right? Is a way of establishing, okay, what are the possibility conditions? But then in logic, as it is contemporary conceived and practiced, the connection of truth seems to be lost. So there is an essential connection of the logical enterprise to truth, but the way in which philosophers of logic and logicians nowadays think about what they do is completely disconnected to it. So this would be my hypothesis, but
Thank you.
Wonderful. So I think it's 9:43. Oh, maybe we could fit in one more question. Is that okay, Ellen?
Of course, yes.
Yeah. So please, the floor is yours.
Yes, yes.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Elena, for your presentation. And I would just to add something to what Alessandro was saying now about the relation between Hegel and Aristotle. Because you said that at the very end, Hegel's logic is a sort of confirmation of Aristotelian logic via Frege. So this makes me some disagreement, I don't know what, because I think that, so you made the example of the predicate, I am a woman, no? So, and the set theory. But I have problem to understand Aristotelian metaphysics of first and second substance in light of the set theory. For instance, Aristotle says in Categories, chapter 5, that the second substance are in the first substance. They belong to the first substance. The verb is euparkusi, which is translated also by inesse, by Boetius. But this construction, no, is not translatable in the sense of set theory, which says, on the contrary, that the elements, the first substance belongs to the universal as second substance. So this is a point for me problematic in a certain sense, but so through which I have some problem to understand Aristotelian metaphysics and consequently its logic in the light of set theory. And another question is also about Hegel's logic. So what is the universal for Hegel? Is a sort of set? Are we sure? You use the symbol U for universal and I for individual. I think in a certain sense that we could use the I for the universal, in the sense that for Hegel, the universal is the I. So this is a very strange thing, of course, but he says this very clear at the beginning of the subjective logic. Otherwise, the subjective logic will be a formal logic. But at the very end, the subjective logic is a transcendental logic. This is very different. And so I have some problem to understand really the Hegel's doctrine of concept, judgment, and syllogism in the sense of formal logic, because it is not at all a formal logic. It's a logic of the I, no? And this is very different. So this is my problem when I understand this treatment of Hegel's logic in a formal way. So the set theory is not at all a good tool in order to understand, I think, neither Aristotle nor Hegel.
Yeah, thank you, Gaetano. I see, I completely understand your worries, and they are expression of on the one side of something true, but on the other side of something wrong, in my view. So the true aspect of what you say is much more work needs to be done in order to make what Hegel says in contemporary so to make it explicit in contemporary terms what Hegel does, what Hegel, how Hegel conceives dialectics, how Hegel conceives the concrete universal, and how Hegel. So evidently, we agree. You and I agree on the fact that Hegel is an Aristotelian. So Hegel completely endorses in his logic the Aristotelian metaphysics, but also the Aristotelian works on logic. So it is, but and then what? So the point. The point in which we agree, on which we agree, is well, so much more work needs to be done in order to explain then the connection between the Hegelian Aristotelianism and the somewhat Aristotelian presuppositions of the idea of logic as it is developed in the history of logic. Okay. But the point on which we don't agree, perhaps, so is the idea that Hegel's attitude towards formal logic is irretrievably critical, and that Hegel's logic is not a formal logic. Hegel criticize evidently formal logic, but there is a fundamental difference between the pre-Hegelian approach to formal logic and Hegelian one. Hegel encompasses the formal logical enterprise within the science of logic. His logic is not an alternative logic with respect to formal logic, but it is a more extended logic, which comprehends formal logic as something that needs to be criticized, but the whole logical categories are within the science of logic. But so I just, it's just the beginning of an answer. I think in order to answer your question, so I need much more time is needed, yes, but I can give you some works that I have written on exactly on your questions, and I can send them to you, and then you can tell me if you agree or not.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful. I could just keep going, whether Hegel's, how he's an Aristotelian. We could talk for 4 more hours about this, but I think we should close up now. It's been a good conversation. So let's thank Elena one more time. Thank you so much for coming. It was really brilliant and wonderful conversation. So
thank you. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Alessandro. Thank you, Franca, Gaetano, everyone for being there.
Yeah, thank you all for coming and for participating in the discussion. And before we go, let me just ask Alex, because I think you have a better sense than I do. What's coming up next? Do you know what's coming up next?
In 2 weeks, I believe, if I'm not wrong, we are going to meet and we will go probably back to the French in a way, because we have Federico Leoni from the University of Verona, and it will give us the final title of this talk this weekend. So we will give you some news at the beginning of next week. But so next meeting is in 2 weeks with Federico Leoni. Again, Elena, thank you so much. And thank you, Franca and Gaetano and all the others who were with us.
All right.
Thank you.
See you all.
Bye.
Thanks so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.